man, the theme song sang for at least a while, right?
No offense to your old theme song, but this shit is baller.
It's fun. The old one sucks in comparison.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. So with that being said, what's up, everybody? It's been a week. We're back. It's Talkin TV. I'm just fucking excited and raring to go because, goddamn, like, I wanted to get this episode out as soon as possible because this is one that I've been looking forward to for a very, very long time. Who am I? You guys should know that by this point. I'm channeling my inner Carlisle now. My voice is a little raspy, but don't worry, I'm not sick because I am, once again, of course, Dom, the movie nerd. One of I released my top 10 worst of the year so far, and it got called Cancer Online. So right now, I'm considering that a win. I am on a winning streak today right now. And with me, of course, as always, is my faithful co-pilot, newly christened, Chris TVN. Chris, what's going on, buddy?
What's up, man? I don't know if we got to talk about that nickname. We forgot to bring that up in the production meeting.
It's definitely a work in progress.
I think it's a big work in progress. And to your thing about being sick, I would like to let the listeners know that the Talkin TV office crew, whatever you want to call us right now, the sickness is gone. We are no longer sick.
Hell yeah.
Dom had that little sickness in his voice last week. I was
2 weeks ago now.
2 weeks ago. Yeah,
something
true.
Like that.
I was out of commission last week.
Yeah.
I mean, down for the goddamn count. I missed going to see Bad Boys for Life.
This is the difference between like you and me is that when I'm sick, and again, this is just like me. I guess I'm like the peak example of human health. Why I got chosen for that, I have no fucking clue. I guess
try to be a little modest,
that's
but
just like a Dr. Manhattan thing going right there. But yeah, I just bounced back real quick. I'm sick for like a day and a half with just like sore throat and just overall annoyance, convenience. But you get knocked on your ass. It's like fucking like
where you had a cold, I got strep throat.
Yeah, literally.
Who can predict this shit?
Who knows? Fucking different immune system regulations and everything. But so, Chris, so we're back. This is our third episode so far for the new year, the new decade. So far, we've hit best of last decade. We hit our favorite TV shows.
That was a fun one.
Before we hit our top 10 favorite movies, because we are still catching up. Don't worry, there was a lot of movies that we watched in 2019.
Good year, apparently.
Really,
it was
really
my
good year.
first year really like diving in and, you know, I guess becoming a cinephile, as people like to call themselves.
Most definitely. And it was definitely one of those situations where after the last couple of years where I have not been quiet at all about my displeasure, where ever since 2016, it just feels like with the exception of a few movies, it's just, that was kind of when we found ourselves like starting to get more and more steeped into this age of mediocrity, let's call it, with the majority of our products, which kind of allowed Netflix and the other streaming services to come in and dominate. But I gotta say, this past year was really, really impressive. So I'm glad that we're kind of saving our top 10 for last, so we can get ourselves each caught up, because there's still a few movies that I'm getting caught up on. There's still a few movies that you're getting caught up on. But so I figured that instead we kind of dive into a little bit of a non sequitur this time, because in the let's call it in the latter half of this decade, there was a studio that popped up that kind of, I'm not going to say went on to define this decade, but they had a very large hand in kind of what made the cinema of the 2010s, if we'll call it, if we're giving a shout out to Mr. Scorsese here. So, Chris, with that being said, what is it that we're talking about in our episode today?
Today we're talking about, and I'm going to try to say this as unbiasedly as possible because it is my favorite movie studio that I've at least been exposed to in the past few years. The amazing, the powerful, the incredibly diverse and fearless, I would call them, fearless A24.
I would use all of those words and more to describe this fucking studio. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the independent film studio known as A24, so this studio was created by film peoples Daniel Katz, David Finkel, and John Hodges, based out of New York City in around 2012. Prior to founding this studio, they worked in film and production before leaving to eventually co-found this company, which was originally A24 Films, before they just cut the films and just made it down to A24, very similar to how, supposedly on advice from Sean Parker, Mark Zuckerberg cut the Facebook just down to Facebook. Little social network reference for you there.
Facebook would have been so weird.
Tell me about it. It's just like
I would not have made an account.
Literally, the line in the movie was drop the. Just Facebook. It's clean. Greatest Justin Timberlake movie performance ever.
Yeah.
Anyways, so they started off with a moderate success with a glimpse inside the mind of Charles Swan III. Don't worry for any of you who have not heard of that movie. I didn't hear about that movie until very recently, but they really blew up onto the scene with their first big, I would say not mainstream success, but their first success in terms of kind of the indie world mind, which is of course Spring Breakers, directed by Harmony Korine and starring James Franco. And they've kind of just been like on a slow and steady roll upwards ever since. You know, this is the studio behind Ex Machina, Room, Moonlight, The Witch, Lady Bird, Good Time, Enemy, fucking Under the Skin, to name a few. And
yeah, and so before we jump into, like, I'd call it like our 2019 year in review of A24, what we're about to really give the listeners, can I ask you, like, just for someone who's sort of been an observer and been, like, pursuing a role in the film, in the industry for a while now, like, what, if you had to guess, because it is a guess, but, like, what do you think is, like, the reason that A24 was founded? Like, they did an amazing thing, but there's so much risk involved. So why would you even take the risk to start a film studio up in the decade where streaming is becoming, like, a big player?
I mean, if I had to guess, we'll take a look at, also keep in mind, this was not obviously the age that we're living in now. This is 2012, 2013, where Netflix has not even kind of forayed and taken that next step into the world of streaming. So streaming is very much so, I'm not going to say it didn't quite exist, but it was not, like, to the level that it is now, first off. Second off, if I had to guess, it was probably just three guys that probably had, like, a little bit of extra money behind them, whether it was because they got a good job, got the right internship, met the right people in school, whatever the case may be, and they just decided to take the logical next step and start their own company, and it just worked out for them. You know,
Okay.
because the other thing that I think they had to their advantage is I have a feeling that, because they even said it, they started out that their model was based exclusively on distribution. So their whole thing is they focused, quite frankly, I think, on the right method that a lot of studios kind of don't look at when it comes to this sort of thing. You know, just look at an example like Annapurna, some great quality film, but not a great distribution system. Like, Annapurna has almost had to file bankruptcy multiple times in the last couple of years. But A24, their model has been exclusively distributing and marketing. Like, they know, as dynamic as their films are, they do have a very steady and consistent look. They know what creators to go for. They figured out their audience really early on, and that's something that they're constantly kind of evolving. And obviously, again, it's like they have their hands really on the pulse when it comes to the money situation, which, again, at the end of the day is something that all these creators don't seem to ever talk about. Hollywood is a business first and foremost, but they're one of the few people that actually manage to make the creative mesh with the business side very well. But of course, being based out of New York City and being kind of right in the mold obviously is always a big advantage.
All right, so that's actually pretty interesting, and I kind of think I see where you're coming from with that. So I think that was honestly a great little background and sort of like, you know, because I guess the last thing I got to ask you now, because, you know, me being newer to film, I kind of like to approach it from, like, my perspective of someone who's just getting into this. So what if we have listeners who are too, right? So with that being said, like, how well known do you think A24 is? Like, do you think the studio's known, being they're such a new studio at this point? Or do you think it's more like they have movies that are hits, but people might not be making the connection that from Uncut Gems to Spring Breakers, there's that same little logo in the beginning? What do you think about that?
It's definitely a situation where, obviously, they started out as a niche, I think, like any small company, especially in today's day and age, should do if they want to thrive. But I think that obviously having, like, such a big hit, because I remember even back in the day when I was in high school seeing stuff about Spring Breakers online and just thinking that, like, wow, this looks like such a crazy different kind of a movie, you know? And that was when I was in high school and I knew nothing about film, you know? Like, I was watching movies, but I knew nothing about film. So obviously I think they made a big impact in terms of how they kind of blew onto the indie scene and, like, kind of getting people that were already in the film world interested. But I think that what made their impact on this year specifically, I think it was a little bit last year with Hereditary, because I would say that Hereditary was probably their first really big hit that struck outside of the typical, you know, kind of niche film groups that were kind of allowing it to thrive, that allowed such things like Ex Machina, Moonlight, and Lady Bird the 3 years before, which were easily their three biggest hits of those subsequent years that they were released, to thrive. Hereditary was kind of their first foray into kind of being recognized by the mainstream. And I feel like with 2019, again, it was a slow and steady build, but with 2019, I feel like is the year that they came to play, and they are now on the precipice of finally being recognized by the mainstream. And I feel like now that we're in a new decade, you know, we're in the 8th year of A24's mainstream existence, I feel like this will be the year that kind of determines and whether A24 will have staying power or whether they'll kind of, like, retreat and go back to being the niche kind of that they were. It's definitely going to be very interesting to see where they go from here on out.
Yeah, and I would say I agree with that because if you look at what Uncut Gems did, if you look at people claiming, oh, Awkwafina got snubbed, I mean, that was snubbed from being in an A24 film, and The Lighthouse, of course, with the Willem Dafoe conversation that came across with the Oscars.
Just a few examples.
Just a few examples of this dynamite year. They were very present in the zeitgeist this year. So with that being said, Dom, we've done our background. We've informed people, I think, to the T. So now let's fucking dissect this. How do you want to take this?
So
what are we doing exactly
today?
today?
For the rest of this episode is there were a decent amount. I believe there was a total of, if I'm checking my numbers right here, there was a decent amount of movies that came out this year. You know, I think it was something about like 15 movies that actually got released this year. But because of the distribution models, they've got a lot of different means of distribution. Some of them go direct to streaming with DirecTV. Very few of them get the big theatrical, release, and also just they don't have enough movies to get like the wide amount of press that they need. So Chris,
I would say in our area we're very fortunate. We kind of get. Because we're close to New York City,
yes.
we kind of get a decent amount of them. So,
most definitely.
So we actually got to see.
But even while I was up at school in Syracuse, like I was able to access a few via streaming because they made a deal via Amazon Prime. That's why so many of their films are available to watch via Amazon Prime.
Oh, that makes sense.
If there is a little bit of a shameless plug, you guys should definitely go and watch some of these movies because I believe that a majority of them, if they're not in theaters, are still available on Amazon Prime. So with that being said, we're going to break down each of the 7 major A24 releases that we both got to watch this year. We're going to break them down by release date. We're going to give you guys a little plot summary, who directed them, kind of give you an idea of what each film is about, and then we're just going to talk about them and rip these films apart. Because, oh man, first of all, I think this is the first year where every single one of these films that I saw made my personal top 20 of the year. And also, each and every single one of these films, you could not put these films next to each other and say that they are really alike in any way, shape, or form other than the directors that did them. Like the cool thing about each and every single one of these films that we are about to talk about is every single one of them has like a unique identity, a unique voice, and a unique dynamic that adds something new to the world of cinema and just for people to think about. Yeah. Which I can't say about really any other studio this year.
That's one of the things that I've kind of fallen in love with this studio is like that's why I described them as fearless in the beginning of this episode. You know, they take on such a vast array of projects. I mean, we only saw 7 of the many films they released this year, but like you said, each film had its own unique characteristic, and it's amazing to know that like a studio is willing to not really like they have a brand. Their brand is they're very artistic. The cinematography is very reminiscent of those classic films that we know and love that are taught in universities. Like they really are known for their movies have a level of tact and craft that I think like we're sort of losing with the whole blockbuster immersion that we're all sort of sucked up under. I meant to say under and in.
Words.
And so because of that, like these movies have to be quick. We got to get the next Marvel film out quick. So you sometimes lose a bit of the craft and tact in filmmaking. So I would say that's A24's brand. And that's why I sort of like you'll hear in this conversation, like not every movie was I super in love with, but all of these movies I will have something good to say about because it's like the way that they curate their selection of films, like that's why to me they're not just like just some people that they don't seem like they're in it for the money. So with that being said, we're going to do this chronologically, right? We're going to do it from when they came out.
So this may not be the order that we actually watched them in because I know for a fact that there are certain films that you watch out of order. I know for a fact that there are certain films that I watch out of order, but we're going to go based on chronologically what it says on their official site, when their official release date was. So in order to kick this list off.
Yeah, what's up first now?
Number 1, Climax. I kind of want to like insert the little dance montage with the intro music. Wow. If you want to see what that is fully, then tune in to my official top 20 of the year. But so Climax is described as a 20. So here's the thing about the tricky thing about Climax is that it technically got released in 2018, but because I go by when it was released in America, not in Europe, unfortunately. It was an international co-production between France and Belgium, directed by the great Gaspar Noé, director of such films as Love and Irreversible, if I'm doing the pretentious French accent, some really crazy, nutty psychological films. What's it called? It takes place during the winter of 1996 within a single building. It features a large ensemble cast of primarily dancers. They're the only mainstream actress that I recognize in this movie was Sofia Boutella from, obviously well known from her work in the Kingsman movies and Hotel Artemis and a couple other things she's been in. And the basic plot of this movie is not structured like a regular movie. It's more of an experience. It's a situation where the first half of this movie is literally all just dance. It's just one long dance montage. The entire film is also in one shot. And then it breaks out into all of these like different crazy little interactions between them. You don't really know what's going on. And then about halfway through the movie, it kicks in literally when they realize that their punch that they're drinking has been spiked by some of the worst, craziest LSD that is known to man, and the rest of the movie is just one nightmare of an acid trip. So, Chris, you and I watched this together at my house for the first time a couple of weeks ago. It was your first time watching it. It was my third time watching it. So, I kind of want to get your thoughts on this movie before we dive in, because I've already talked ad nauseum about my thoughts on this movie. But in order to kind of kick this off, what did you think of Climax?
Yeah, so I actually am really proud of my Letterboxd review, and I also think like I sort of nailed my exact feeling. So I'm just gonna like read that, and then I'll elaborate a little more if that's cool with you.
Most definitely.
So, quoting now, I said, "Well, I saw it. I'm not trying to make that seem like a bad thing or belittle this movie in any way, because there are many redeeming and impressive qualities to this film. But again, I have to reiterate my initial statement. I saw it, and that is something I now have to live with forever, because this movie feels like a heart attack waiting to happen. I would not watch this with anyone elderly in your family. I would not watch this film with anyone who has high anxiety, and I certainly wouldn't watch this if you guys were all like taking shrooms, because you have to be smart when you do drugs and stuff. So if you guys are trying to plan like that type of night, like say you're a part of our college crowd that listens to the show, save this movie for the next morning. Seriously. Because do yourself a goddamn favor. This movie is intense, but while it's intense, it is also mesmerizing. Yes. You can't take your eyes off the screen. The cinematography is brilliant. The set design is so awesome.
The use of color and the lighting. Oh my God, the costume design. Yeah, this is definitely one of those movies where, again, it's more of an experience than a traditional film. Like, you don't watch this movie in order to, like, kind of get enraptured in the story, because the story is literally just one half dancing, one half fucking psychedelic, the worst goddamn acid experience that you probably ever have seen put to screen. Now, the one thing I can say is that for anybody who ever has done psychedelics like that, this is probably one of the most accurate feelings that you can get when in terms of seeing that kind of feeling portrayed on the big screen. And No definitely does an incredible job with kind of like portraying those feelings by like the way that he moves the camera, because this film, if I'm not mistaken, it is another one of those films that is done all completely in one take. But oh my God, like I don't even know where to begin. Because the other interesting thing is that if we're just talking about the cast and kind of the naturalist feel of what this movie achieves, that with the exception of Sofia Boutella and one other person in this movie, I think it's the chick that is revealed to be pregnant, no other person in this movie is an actual actor. Like it's another one of the situations where they just, I've been seeing this trend pop up in the last couple of years where they just pull in regular people.
They just want that realism.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it worked out. I mean, like I said, like this movie, it has a way of sucking you in. These characters are all pretty shitty people, like once you get to know them, but yet you're rooting for them and you hope they make it through this terrible night.
It's definitely one of those like situations where I heard that a lot of the criticisms levied against this movie were because they felt it was a little bit too nihilistic and that a lot of the characters kind of, you couldn't root for any of them. But in that situation, I just say, I'm like, to me, what got me through it is I just felt like I was watching real people. And it's like, at a certain point, it's like, I don't care how shitty and shallow they are, nobody deserves to go through that experience, you know? Fucking, as somebody who has done psychedelics and kind of been through that kind of a level of like psychological trauma multiple times, like nobody deserves to go through that shit. I don't care who you are. And I don't know what's crazier, the fact that this movie kind of calmed me down when I was on an experience like that, because fun fact, the first time I watched this movie, I was on acid myself, and
that's kind of why I brought it up the way I did. I was just making a little joke about what you had said to me. The other thing
is that when you find out who it is that spiked their drink and why she did it, it's like, what the hell? It's just one of those movies where I've talked about kind of the human condition, and it's something, and how that's something that precious few people would really understand, because if they truly did, it would like break them mentally. And this is like one of the few movies that I've seen that like actually demonstrates that. It's one of the reasons why I just freaking loved this movie. It's so nihilistic, almost to a fault, but like the filmmaking just keeps you enraptured. And like there's never a minute where you could look away, just like you said.
Yeah, and they brought a little kid into it, which is always unfair, and it pulls in the heartstrings in all the right way. That's an easy trope that could have went the wrong direction and could have sort of soured your taste on what is a pretty cool and interesting premise, but it didn't. So I think that's I don't want to spoil it for anyone.
Without spoiling anything, there's a trend that has popped up in recent years concerning kids in movies, and without spoiling anything, I think this is probably like, I don't know, I don't want to say my favorite because that'll probably like kind of reveal me as like a fucked up person, but it's one of the best, I think, of how these types of situations is played out.
Yeah, I'd agree. So with that being said, I feel like we've kind of given a nice little summary of Climax. Do we want to do like a mini rating, or do we want to just move on to the next thing?
Again, this is not one of the situations where we're rating. This is just a situation where we're kind of talking about each movie and then we're moving on to the next one. So,
yeah, well, it was a great film. I liked it.
I loved it. So if we're moving on now, the next one that we have, so Climax, again, it got a wide release on, oh my god, gotta scroll through the list here, on March 1st, technically. So the next film, according to this chronological order, again, continuing with the track record of absolutely batshit insane French films, like, don't remember, I was never really necessarily a fan of the French New Wave in school, but I just gotta admire these French directors. Like, they give no fucks and pull no punches when it comes to portraying certain matters, because the second film that we have on our list, one of, again, that you just watched recently, I watched this up at school and was blown away by it, and then when I went down to Tribeca Film Festival in April, a couple of my friends saw it in theaters and were like, bro, that was crazy. I'm like, I fucking love this movie, and that is Claire Denis' High Life, which is described as an erotic science fiction horror film, which stars Robert Pattinson as one of many prisoners that is kind of shunted together on a shuttle in space, literally just sent out into the black hole of space to die. Their crimes are not necessarily brought to the forefront, but the whole thing is that as they're kind of just on this kind of slow train to death, for lack of a better word.
One-way trip.
They're kind of trapped with this doctor that's played by Juliette Binoche, who is this crazy, insane, psychotic doctor who just, like, is given free reign, because, again, it's a situation where these prisoners are not treated like people, to just kind of play around and literally fuck with, like, different, like, reproduction methods, you know? Because there's this whole, because the movie is playing around with ideas of sexuality and, like, actual, like, sci-fi, like, reproduction. Like, it's one of the ballsiest sci-fi movies that I've seen in a while.
Well, basically what they tackle is, once you break through the Earth's atmosphere, there is a substantial amount of radiation in our galaxy because of the sun and all the X-rays being emitted. So they take the idea that we've seen in things like Battlestar and stuff, where it's like hard to get pregnant in space, and they sort of like, this is that one doctor's mission. She keeps her sanity on their one-way voyage into the eye of a black hole by just fighting to impregnate the females on the ship with the sperm of the males. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I never thought I'd talk about that on the show, but
that's literally what the movie's about. Yeah, exactly.
And so I think it's also even more about, like you just said in the last film, the human condition, where it's like, you know, you can take the boy out of the city, but you can't take the city out of the boy. Like these people still are shitty people. I mean, this film, there's a scene where one of the males tries to rape one of the females. They're constantly like hitting each other with glass or stabbing each other with scissors. Like these people are just as bad on Earth as they are in space, and even more hideous. And so it's like hard to really root for anyone, because you find out that Robert Pattinson's character killed a dog, which, like, fuck you killed the dog.
Right?
But he's like the best of the worst. And so you're sort of like, okay, I guess I'm on his team, but it is, as uncomfortable as Climax was, this is like an erotic, uncomfortable film.
Like, oh my god. Like, and without spoiling anything, especially because you kind of have no choice, because this isn't a spoiler, this was in the trailer, where he's literally the last man standing.
Yeah, he's the last man standing, but what I thought this film did interesting was, like, you don't really need too much of the backstory. I like how Earth was shown through, like, these video clips, these very grainy, like, VHS looking, like, that sort of come and go, because it's really not about where they were, it's about where they're going and how they're reacting to where they're going. And it sort of does what I think Ad Astra was trying to do. I think this film, so I actually liked Ad Astra as a film better, but I think that this film, like Detective Pikachu, had a very clear mission, a very clear statement they were trying to make, and they achieved their goal, right? Because Because if you look at Detective Pikachu, and I'm gonna bring it back to High Life in a second.
I love how you keep bringing it back to Detective Pikachu.
Well, because that movie worked, right? That movie had a few simple missions. We want family-friendly fun. We want you to laugh. We want you to be on this wild ride for us, and we want it to be clear and understandable the whole way through. Yeah, obstacles come up by the way, and we watch the characters solve them. But at the end of the day, like, the message is clearly presented, which is hard to do sometimes in space movies because you're
this subject matter that we're dealing with.
Especially with this subject matter, because space, you play with time, you play with black holes, you play with things that we don't really understand yet. We're just sort of speculating at. So I think that's why a lot of space movies are messy, and this movie is messy, no pun intended, but it's messy in different ways, in more erotic ways, and the message is very clear, and so I'll give it that. I personally, really honestly didn't like the film that much.
Really?
It wasn't my type of space film, but I enjoyed how clear the idea was and how well executed it was. That's what I'm trying to say. I think that this filmmaker had an idea and they really executed it well.
Again, definitely just another situation of, again, the French give no fucks. Like, pretty much exactly, you pretty much took all the words out of my mouth. Claire Denis had a very specific mission that she was wanting to mess around with in this movie, and she stuck to her guns. Kind of to bring it back to your point about Ad Astra, I do agree. I think Ad Astra is a better movie overall, but again, it's kind of falls back on those kind of traditional American values that we know of. The good old, country-grown boy, braving the elements in order to find and bring back those who he loves, versus this one, again, it's another so goddamn nihilistic, where it's like these people are literally just on a one-track mission to their deaths. Like, it is a situation where kind of it's been talked about in media how human beings are the only creatures that are aware of their own mortality, and this movie just puts it on the forefront. And kind of the juxtaposition, like you were talking about, of kind of trying to create life in a situation where there was only death to come about, and in a way succeeding, because at the end it kind of sucks kind of bringing this child into the ship, only to ultimately doom it to die. But it kind of like, especially when she's older near the end and like she's a teenager, interact with Pattinson, that sort of like give you a little bit of uncomfortable thoughts, because like, oh god, it's like, it doesn't matter if they are related, like what do you do when it's like what the end goal is gonna be, and it's like you're both kind of old enough for like reproduction? Like, that started to make me ask questions that I don't want to start to ask. So,
yeah, I'm right there with you.
Yeah,
the thing about this movie is, like, I don't hate the film, I just didn't like it because the subject matter is a very bitter pill to swallow, and it's very abrasive, and so I think it wanted you to feel that way, and so that's why I think this movie worked, because I felt very off-put, I felt very uncomfortable, and it was such a weird juxtaposition because the cinematography and the mise-en-scène is gorgeous.
Brilliant.
And so it's
brilliant.
I just didn't know how to feel while watching it. I was just like, man, I want this to end, but I also don't. So with that being said, that's me with High Life. You gotta see it.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
You gotta see it.
Yeah, it's one of those musts. It's like, again, it's a disturbing, difficult watch, but once you get through it, oh man, it was well worth it. So,
and that's what I like about A24. Before we jump into the next film, is like a lot of these films aren't easy to digest. Actually, one of my favorite things to do is expose some of our friends who aren't really into film to these movies, because it takes like the good parts of experimental filmmaking and shows you that, hey, like, open your eyes up to this, because once you it's like jazz. A lot of people have a hard time getting into jazz, but once you understand it and you're in, then you're into this whole new beautiful world of culture and experimentation that is just something you wouldn't be exposed to in the mainstream.
Just opening doors to new avenues. So with that being said, that was High Life. We're 2 in. We got 5 more. So the next one, again, is one, I don't remember if this is the first one that I recommended to you or if it was the first one you watched, but I just remember that when it was a movie that I kind of found a little bit hard to get into. But once I did and I kind of understood what kind of the movie was going for, I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of dig this. And I know that when I recommended this to you, you were like, bro, this is like one of the craziest movies I've ever seen. And that is, of course, David Robert Mitchell's Under the Silver Lake, which is described as a neo-noir black comedy conspiracy thriller. It's a lot of different genres kind of brush into one, which is set in LA, kind of like this hunkering, wavy, almost dreamlike experience, not unlike that of a David Lynch movie, where you follow around this kind of bum loser named Andrew, who's just a guy, played by Andrew Garfield, ironically enough. Actually, wait, no, that's not his name. Andrew Garfield is the actor. The character's name is Sam. His character, Sam, played by Andrew Garfield, is kind of just this guy who just wanders around LA. He doesn't work. He doesn't have a job for no other reason other than he just doesn't work. He kind of just lives in an apartment. He's late on his rent. And he just kind of wanders around LA, going to these different parties, sleeping with these other random girls. It's just literally the idea of just a directionless guy. Almost to the point of where, like, he kind of just, like, makes shit up for no reason. And his life is, of course, thrown for a loop when he finds this girl just swimming randomly in his pool in the backyard. You know, again, typical. Again, it's a situation where I've never been to LA, but I feel like anybody who has would know this type of setup and these types of characters where this girl that he sees swimming in his pool goes missing the next day, and he kind of like makes it, he's all of a sudden reawakened. He makes it his life's goal in order to find her. And it kind of takes him into this whole crazy, like underground and kind of exposing what LA really is. And it's a slow burn, but it is a nutty burn. And it's just one of those kind of throwbacks to those crazy, weird noirs that just, like, sets out to, like, truly expose you to a different world. And, like, it's crazy to me how this movie managed to make LA just feel like such a completely different beast. Like, I've heard about the differences between East Coast and West Coast mentalities a bunch of different times, but this is kind of like the first movie that kind of made me visually aware of that. So, Chris, you talked about Under the Silver Lake when you saw it the first time. So, what again, kind of break it down for me even more so. Like, what were your thoughts when you saw this movie for the first time? And because I want to see if you like had kind of like the same reaction that I did when I watched it.
Yeah, so you were right. This certainly was the movie that I think I can say that I fell in love with A24 as a studio, and it's now I have to fight a bias when I see one of their films because I just assume I'm gonna like it because this movie, god damn it. You know, movies like Lady Bird and Moonlight prior had piqued my interest. Oh, the same studio put both of these films out there. They're pretty good. But this is the film where I was like, wow. So, you know, this movie to me is, it's my kind of movie, man. I don't need a giant amount of exposition, and it's okay if the show don't tell is a little skimp, as long as it's intriguing and the mystery and the allure and like the atmosphere is enough to just suck you in, because this movie isn't as plot driven as maybe the trailers make it seem, or as you would want it to be. When you hear noir, you think like, oh, a detective and it's going to be a very clear case and he's going to go through the steps. It's a little more atmospheric, and it's almost, it to me, this might not be correct, so I say to me because I know you're a little more adept in the whole pinpointing a genre of something, but it feels even a little slice of lifey, and I like that because I think LA is very much so romanticized. For a long time, I was hell-bent on moving out there. I had to take my vacation out there,
Yep.
right? You know that, Dom.
Yep.
And I came back and I was very disappointed because it was sleazy. It was a dirty place, and the people were pretty scummy. And, you know, this movie, I think, is great because it sort of paints the depiction that you don't get. And so this movie felt real, and it felt very tangible, and that's why I like this film. Aside from the fact that this is a masterclass in lighting. I mean,
Yeah.
everything cinematically about this film is awesome for the most part, but to me, the lighting was like, when do you watch a film and you're really just like, I can't wait to see how this next shot is lit because of how good the first few shots are? Like that, I don't usually think that. So yeah, I love this film. I'm over the moon about this movie. I don't think enough people will ever see it, and that's unfortunate.
Again, it's a question of where, obviously, what it is that you want to see from a movie. Because I remember the whole big thing is this movie had a crazy release date schedule. A24 wanted to put this out originally last year. Well, 2 years ago now, in 2018. I think it was the original date was slated for November. And they kept pushing the release date back because it kept failing miserably in all of the test screenings, because like some of the things that people were pissed off about, they found the script confusing, they thought it was too cryptic, they thought it lacked substance, they thought it lacked depth, all this stuff. Again, it's all the typical stuff that you get with test screenings. And it's funny because I keep thinking back to a joke that Red Letter Media made, where it's like, all of the great films usually, unfortunately, do not have like the popcorn fun that a lot of the big films that we have now get, where it's like they made this joke of like, where could you imagine The Shining going through a modern day test screening? Like, it would fail miserably. It would never get released. And that's kind of a similar thought process that I have when it comes to this movie, where for a long time, this movie just feels like it is meandering and dragging its footsteps. And I have no clue what's going on. I have no clue what it's leading to. I'm just kind of along for the ride. I'm like, okay, I'm kind of in this now. I kind of have to see where this goes. And I'm getting into the world, but it's like, there's nothing really that's appealing for me here. LA looks gross. All these characters are really confusing. Again, the thing that was kind of getting me through it was kind of the David Lynchiness of it, where I'm like, okay, I can kind of perceive this almost as like being, you called it slice of like, I would go for more so dreamlike quality, where it almost feels like everything in this movie is just like could be easily a figment of this guy's imagination, just because he's to a point now where he ultimately realizes the pointlessness of his life, and this is literally just facets that he's making up in order to justify his continued existence. But when the movie ends, that's kind of when I realize, I'm like, oh wait, I was thinking about this to completely flip. It's not his existence that is just completely irrelevant. It's just the existence of this place. Because, and this is going to sound like a real stretch, but bear with me for a minute, where one of the things that I always thought was one of the funniest and yet most accurate things that the Percy Jackson books did right was having Mount Olympus, based above the Empire State Building, and hell, Hades, the underworld, under LA. And after seeing this movie, I completely understand, because it was literally like, wow, it's just like, existence is pointless. It's like, this is just, everyone in this movie felt like they were asleep. Everyone in this movie kind of just felt like they were wandering around. I say Lynchian, not in the sense of like kind of the dreamlike quality, but in kind of like the disturbing, startling imagery, because every once in a while, you would just have that one figure or that one symbol that comes in, you know, for example, like the video footage with the woman in the owl mask, when he visits the songwriter's mansion, when he meets the homeless guy that claims himself to be like the
homeless king.
Yeah, the homeless king, that guy, like all this crazy shit. And I realized that I'm like, holy shit, this was one of the most fascinating deconstructions of just modern day thought process that I've seen, and it was brilliant. And this coming from the guy whose last big known movie was, STDs as a horror monster, you know, because he directed the movie It Follows, which the basic premise of that is,
I didn't see that. I didn't even know that.
The basic premise of that, it's this invisible silent monster that kills people, and the whole thing, it follows people around, and the whole thing is that these kids pass it off to one another by having sex with each other.
So would you say artist progression?
A little bit, but in this one, I would say for this movie, it's more so of a de-escalation kind of, because again, it's one of those movies where by the time things end, you ask yourself, well, what's really changed? And it's very, very rare that you can make something like that work. But this is one of those situations where I definitely think they pulled it off. And it was just, again, it's everything that you said. It was a masterclass in everything that it was going for.
Yeah, I'd say it's not for everyone, but I would say my final statement on this is give it a chance.
Again, I feel like that's something that we're going to say about a decent amount of these movies. But once we get into like some of the later installments, you know, we had to get past some of these like initial crazy installments in order to get into the stuff that people watch. So if we're moving on now, our fourth film that we saw, so we're moving ahead a few months. The technical wide release for Under the Silver Lake was April, but I remember A24 finally said, fuck it, we're not going to bother releasing this in theaters, we're just going to drop it. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe I did watch it still in the winter. It was January when I watched that movie. So now we're fast forwarding ahead a couple of months. And this was actually a movie that we saw together in theaters at the same time. And the interesting thing about this movie is that, again, this is the same director who only 1 year before, I would say, did A24's biggest and most well-recognized movie. This was a movie that people were complaining should have been nominated for Oscars. They were hailing it as a revolutionary horror movie, and that was, of course, Ari Aster's Hereditary. And my whole relationship with Hereditary was that I thought the first two-thirds were good. It was a very, very well-done effort for a first-time director. They were very good. And the third act, specifically the last act where they're resolving things, I thought was just typical horror schlock nonsense. And I was confused as hell why everyone was praising that movie. But I'm like, okay, fine. I get it. First-time effort. Not everyone's going to react the same way. You know, there's been a decent amount of people who have made debuts. You know, not everyone can have kind of like the effect of that they had with The Witch, you know, with Robert Eggers. But...
Right.
Fast forward a year later, and this is actually like I don't think I've seen like a situation where a guy does back-to-back efforts. Ari Aster's releasing his second movie, Midsommar, and you and I watched that in theaters the first time. And if I'm kind of breaking open the lid on this, whereas I thought Hereditary was good, I didn't love it, but I thought it was a well-done effort. With my problems with the third act, I could not fucking stand Midsommar. That movie was dreadful. It was drawn out. It felt like a torture fest. I thought the most interesting parts about that movie were within the first opening scene, and then the rest of it just meanders along. Very pretty to look at, very well shot and everything, but this was kind of the movie that showed it's like, okay, I am not a fan of Ari Aster as a director.
Now, I'll cut this out if you don't want people to know that you said this, because I'm saying something you said to me in private, but is this sort of the movie that made you say the other day that you think Ari Aster's a hack? And if you don't want to get into this, I can cut it.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. I just never know.
That's fine.
So.
Yeah, no, so I should preface that by saying that it's not a situation of where I think he's a hack in the sense of not being a good director. I think he is a good director. He obviously knows how to frame shots. He knows how to get lighting. He knows how to tell a story in an interesting way that kind of builds tension and suspense. Where I think he's a hack is, again, it's another situation where I can't really blame the artist. I blame the hype that he gets, the type of following that he generates. That's what annoys me, because every once in a while, again, I don't say this often because, again, art is largely, again, as much as I hate to say it, it is largely dependent on the fans and your type of following and the reactions you get. But it's one of the situations where his following just overhyped the shit out of his movies so much that not only was I like, okay, I don't really get what it's all about, but it's also a situation of where, like, it kind of just ruins any sense of, like, enjoyment that I can get out of the movie. And I can already tell that he's another cynical filmmaker. Like, you already said, like, I am not trying to make people, like, enjoy my movies. I am trying to make these as torturous as possible. But if I'm going into actually what I meant by that, my whole thing is that if you're really breaking down his movies, what really anything new is he adding to the horror genre? If you really think about it, like, to me, again, this is a thing that I saw, like, again, it's one of those hacky meme quotes that just gets repeated over and over and over again, but I have to agree with it where, again, Midsommar was already done. It was The Wicker Man in the 70s. We already got a shitty Nicolas Cage remake of that, but it's like, if I want to see The Wicker Man, I'll just go rewatch The Wicker Man. I don't need to see this,
Okay, that makes sense. Now, see, the horror genre right now is in a very interesting place to me. It's sort of, there's been a resurgence. You're getting a lot of horror films, and it seems to be a lot of directorial debuts, and also there's a lot of different takes. So why did I like Midsommar? Okay, with me just saying that. I liked it because, like you said, it was long and it was tough to get through, and so you almost feel like the survivor that you don't meet in this film. Like it tries you just as much as this movie tries what we watch the actors go through. In a good way though, because like you said, he knows the technicals. It's not like a visually terrible movie to watch. It's actually pretty good. The set design's pretty cool. I like the cult that he designed. I like a lot about this movie. The reason why it's not in my top 10, a little spoiler for next week, and it was at one point, as I saw more movies, it wedged its way out, is because I think that, I hope, as a young director, he gets a little more, his message gets clouded as the movies go on, right? And that's what I found in Midsommar. So where you had me at a very strong, let's call it first and second act, the need to do something shocking and alarming and almost triggering with the cannibalism in that third act, I think took away from what could have been a very, very tactful finish to a really cool setup.
Literally pretty much like beat for beat my thought process on Hereditary, where I am so, like, say what you will about Hereditary. Like, I don't hate Hereditary as much. Like, I would say that, again, I like Hereditary. I think it's a good movie. I do not like Midsommar. But the thing that I will say about Hereditary is, again, it's one of those movies where I don't really know what's going to happen. And I like that, it is very good about building up to, like, shocking things happening, like the little girl getting her head knocked off. That was legitimately a shocking moment. I'm like, whoa, that kind of woke me up in terms of, like, kind of like the first act is almost sleep-inducing, and then we're in for the rest of the film. But then I realized by the time the third act happens, I'm like, oh shit, this is literally all this guy has going for him. It is just long drawn-out build-out, long drawn-out build-up, long drawn-out build-up to shocking, to... Again, shock, but the thing that I don't like about it is, again, it's kind of the same problems that I have with the creators of Game of Thrones, where it's long, drawn-out build, where it's what they were invested in, which is not the actual story, not the characters, just drawing it out, torturing the characters for as long as they can, and then just building up to shock for shock value's sake, and I hate that. That is a trend that I've noticed pop up that a lot of creators have gone to, that is a very easy cop-out, and I can't fucking stand it, because to me, that takes away from good storytelling. It adds nothing to it. And in the long run, I think you're only doing yourself a disservice.
I mean, yes to all that. I'm so glad you brought up shock value, because this is where I'm going to close out my thoughts on Midsommar. So, shock value, right? I think if you look at movies like High Life and you look at movies like From Under Silver Lake, right? There's a very tasteful way to sprinkle in your shock value. And even in horror films, we've seen The Witch. There's a great way to do shock value that isn't sort of like, look at me, I'm a scary movie now. And so I think if this director can sort of find the line between his craft, which is very well nuanced, and he's obviously well versed and he's a filmmaker, but if he can just figure out how to just be a little less, I don't want to say obnoxious because that's rude, but like obnoxious because I can't think of something else.
I would agree with you. Obnoxious. It is obnoxious what he goes to in terms of just how he goes for shock value's sake.
And so that's why I'll at least see what he puts out, maybe his next 2 movies. He'll at least have me for a little while longer because I'm hoping for some growth there.
Definitely. And if I'm closing out my thoughts on it, I did hear that, again, I never like to shit on any new and upcoming director. I always want to be in with them for as long as I possibly can until I just finally say, okay, I'm like 4 or 5 films in and I still haven't seen anything new. I'm done. But Ari Aster, again, this is only his second movie, so I would still be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. I do think he is still one of the up-and-coming talents that definitely does have a very bright future ahead of him. But what I'll say is that I definitely think that horror is a genre that he needs to get away from, because I feel like it is the horror tropes and cliches that I can't stand that are a large part of the reason why for so long I wouldn't even tolerate the horror genre, and that he needs to get away from. And what he has said is that he is planning on making his next movie not a horror movie, which I'd be glad for, because I think that his tropes and his techniques that he utilizes would be of much better use, put to much better use in a different genre other than horror. Like, I've seen it twice now. I'm not a fan of what he does with it, so I would say let's just move on from that. So that was Midsommar.
If we're moving on.
Yeah, right, moving on. Oh, wow. How did you know? But so that goes forward. We move forward a month. That was, what's it called? Midsommar was released actually in the beginning of July. So no, never mind. We're staying in the same month. So we're only moving forward a few weeks, which is, again, doing a complete 180. We are still talking about death, but from a very, very different viewpoint. I would say a much more touching and heartfelt viewpoint, which again speaks to me more so. I'm much more so a fan. Don't get me wrong, I love my shocking and disgusting movies, but I'm also a huge sucker for those really heartfelt gut punches movies, because the next one, the number 5 on this list, is The Farewell, directed by another newcomer, Lulu Wang. This is her first feature debut film that stars Awkwafina as what is it? It's first generation. Yeah, first generation.
Well, she's an immigrant herself.
She is an immigrant herself. I wasn't sure if she was born in the U.S. or in China, but
she's an immigrant. She moves to America when she's 6. I just watched this movie last week, so it's fresh on the mind. And she's trying to be a writer because, as most people find when they come to America, the youth is given a chance to be a little more artistic and a little more creative, because the parents actually have a country that they can, and they talk about that. Like, the American dream allows Awkwafina to be a 30-year-old who still hasn't really found her career path yet.
Absolutely.
Let's just put it that way.
Absolutely. And of course her world is thrown for a loop when she discovers that her grandmother, who is still living back in China, given the nickname Nene by her, has been diagnosed with a severe form of cancer, and that she is going to be dying of a terminal illness and will be dying in a few months. And also discovers, quite shockingly, that the rest of the family will convene for the first time in several years. They have not seen each other, but are planning on keeping the illness a secret from her grandmother, and will be convening under the guise of the fact that her cousin is getting married. But it's all a sham, really, just so that they can see the grandmother off for the first time. And this is kind of a new practice, because Awkwafina's character, Billy is her name, again, as somebody who has been primarily brought up in the West, is unfamiliar with this Eastern practice and culture, and is rather confused by it. And again, as stated by her mom, just stay home. Don't come, because you're too emotional. She'll see you, and she'll get one whiff of you, and she'll figure out that something's up. But she goes anyway, because she says, fuck it, this is my grandma, and she's dying. I'm not gonna let that get in the way. And it kind of breaks open into this whole new world of kind of bringing Western and Eastern practices together in order to kind of find a perfect middle ground. And though as much as I disliked Midsommar, I fucking loved this movie. I loved this movie so much. I saw it with my grandma, ironically, and we both, don't worry, my grandma's fine. She's not dying anytime soon. And I absolutely love this movie. It was so delightful. It was heartwarming. It was definitely true to life, I would say. It's one of those situations that I describe where I talk about these types of family movies. Again, that's kind of another term that's kind of been bastardized by Disney over the last couple of years. Fun for the whole family. And this is kind of what I think of as a family movie. Not one of the shitty American movies where it's just a joke a minute and a bunch of random things that just happen with the fun, heartwarming message at the end. No, this is one of those situations where this felt like real people actually getting together and actually, kind of getting all the rules. Because the thing that I talked about, which is where whenever you're with your family, it's almost never like just consistent. It's awkward, it's messy, you kind of get out all your feelings, all your grievances, but at the end of the day, you still have that relationship of blood that you don't have with anybody else. And at the end of the day, that is going to win and triumph over everything else. And that, to me, again, it's a situation where I'm watching a Chinese family, you know, as an Italian kid. You know, I'm a third-generation immigrant, but, like, the last person I know that came directly off the boat was my great-grandfather, who died, like, when I was a baby, before I even really got a chance to know him. And so, yeah, that just, I felt like that, and that still spoke to me, that kind of idea.
Well, this movie has a lot going on where I think if you were put off by the marketing and you said, all right, I've seen this kind of movie before, a movie about loss. There's so much more. It's a battle of culture. It's West versus East. This movie is also parental versus child. I mean, the parents have done everything for their daughter, yet they simultaneously, at every chance they get, sort of like kind of beat her down and almost resent her for getting chances that she doesn't have. But the strange thing is, for how dysfunctional this family is, they all can sort of put it aside for their Nana, whatever her nickname was. And so to me, it makes you wonder, like, wow, once this person leaves, what is going to happen to this family? And I think, like, a movie really works in this setting when you're thinking about, like, oh, well, what can happen in this world if this happens? Because you're just so invested in this film. The cultural portrayal of, like, China and, like, how, you know, they even say, the uncle says to her at one point, like, but this is the thing you have to understand. This is how it is over here. You're Americanized now. I think, like, if even if you're not an immigrant, this movie can really resonate because, like, there is a whole nother world out there. And while we try to be open-minded, right, our generation's like the whole, you know, there's more than just our little scope. But are you actually really exposing yourself to that? Maybe not, because a film like this makes you think, I never would think to not tell someone I love that they, you know, have a terminal disease. Why would I hide that from them? But it's us thinking like that is so alien to them, whereas it's so common for the family to take on the burden over there. And this film is a burden, if we're going to talk about it as a film now, aside from just like the context that it carries, right? I mean, this film is an emotional heartstring tugger. You're trying, I mean, I had to fight back the tears. I watched this at home. I had to pause. I was like, yo, listen, I know you're not supposed to do this while watching movies, but I don't really feel like crying right now, so I'm going to go take a 5, make myself a cup of coffee, come back and finish the back half of this movie. And that's only halfway through it.
Yeah.
I mean,
got to like the emotional couple, but that's
yeah,
just like on the comedy parts of it. But kind of to bounce off what you were saying, literally, it's like, you're right, where kind of we as immigrant children, because we are, you know, think about it, like, I don't think there's a single person living in America today that is not descended from an immigrant of some capacity, you know, Irish, Italian, Asian, fucking
we're the melting
Middle
pot.
Eastern, like every person that's living in this country that is not Native American is an immigrant in some capacity. And obviously we have, like, obviously some of us are so displaced that it's like we you know, we consider ourselves to be fully Americanized, but I like the idea of kind of tackling the idea of some of the more recent generations, you know, again, in this case, tackling the Asian culture and how the idea of where they consider themselves Chinese, but then when they actually go back and see how it goes in the traditionalist country, yeah, they may speak the language, yeah, they may have been brought up with those values, but until you actually see it in person, you realize that it is a completely different world. It's funny because that actually goes back to a point that I saw got brought up on The Sopranos that I bring up all the time, where you look at the Italian Americans, I'm talking like the greaseball Goombas, you know, from like, that grew up in like the 70s and 80s, they all consider themselves to be Italians, but once they go over and actually see how things are done in Italy, it's like night and day. Like, I look at an Italian American and an actual Italian, having seen both kinds of nationalities, and they're two different sects to me. And that was really interesting, seeing how this film tackled that from a different perspective. And again, if we're just talking about the emotional gut punches, like,
so many.
Oh my God. I don't even know where to begin.
What I will say is, I mean, it's an A24 film, so there is a high quality. The filmmaking's there, the performances, the acting, it's all great. I don't think we need to talk about that in this film. We need to talk about how real of a situation this is. I mean, the whole time I was watching this movie, I was thinking, like, I just can't wait for this to be over and I can go downstairs and hug my grandma, because, like, yeah, God, life's too short.
Yeah.
And I think
I was so happy that I watched this with my grandma. It was like the perfect person to watch it with.
That's a great movie, because there's an appreciation there. I mean, the fact that you're already hanging out with your grandma watching this film, I think that's what this movie if this movie had one goal, if I was the filmmaker, I would say, even though this movie's about a family that's going to be broken apart, I want to bring people together to watch this film. So like you said, to my conclusion statement, this is a great example of, like you said, the other side of a family film. It's not fun. It's not happy. It's not there's not a joke every minute, but there still is something there that you want to be close to loved ones while watching this film, and that's the point of a family movie, right?
Kind of just when I'm watching them like get drunk at the faux wedding, it's like they're just going in the circle playing those games. I'm like, shit, that's like shit that like I do with my family now, just like kind of seeing all the cousins that are grown up and kind of seeing the passing the torch to the next generation, kind of the different things that are brought up. But it's like they try to call them out. It's just like, well, why are you lying to her? When she tries to call them out on their hypocrisy, then she's like, well, she did the same thing to her husband, And then when you actually see kind of that the idea, it might work because it alleviates them of the burden, kind of the idea that you brought up with the brother talking about how in the East it is much more centered on the unit than the individual, which again is something that we as Americans already find difficult because everything in America is so based on individualization and the American dream, which is something that the East does not have. And in my opinion, it's why the East has prospered for so goddamn long, why they keep going with these traditional practices. And kind of to wrap up my point and why I feel like this film was as effective and impactful as it was is that the director Lulu Wang based this on experiences from her real life. You even saw the clips at the end of, her own Nene, and guess what? Her Nene is still alive.
Thank God, I needed that. I needed that little home video clip.
So that's kind of like a little bit of a relief from kind of the overall, like kind of you're waiting this entire movie, and the ending is a really sad ending.
So
they
sad.
don't need to show her dying, obviously, in order to still have
because we've all had that
quiet
moment with our family where we're like, what do you say? There are those moments in life where if you say something, it just makes it worse. And so I mean that's the farewell.
There is beauty inside, and not to harp on the performances too much, but I think we can both agree Awkwafina and the grandma Zhao Shuzhen both fucking snub. Zhao as the grandma is my absolute favorite supporting performance of the year.
So good. I mean,
so goddamn good, so believable, such a naturalistic performance.
Hey, this might be in conversation for next week for me. We'll see. Maybe not.
So, moving on. So, we have tackled 5 of our movies so far for A24. We got 2 more. And number 6, is another movie that we both watched together. Oh, yeah. Now we're getting to the big dogs. But don't get me wrong, I love The Farewell. I loved The Farewell. But these next 2 movies that we're about to talk to might be like peak 2019 A24, because our next one is a sophomore outing. Robert Eggers made his debut back in 2016 with one of the most ferocious outings, not only into A24, but in the world of horror with The Witch, and he continued that with his sophomore effort that was released in October this year, The Lighthouse, which features around Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe as 2 lighthouse keepers that are assigned to just this random barren rock of a lighthouse in, I want to say, I keep fucking up the time period.
It's the 1600s.
1600s England, and what's it called? And the first half of this film is literally just them going about their time, working on the lighthouse. Robert Pattinson is kind of just a normal guy. Willem Dafoe was this old ass cranky pirate who talks in like fucking like old sailor tongue and like farts every 30 seconds and just orders Pattinson around like a slave. And then a storm hits and all hell breaks loose. That seemed to be a common trend this year with A24 movies, with kind of these isolated settings and just people going fucking nuts. But I don't think any other movie this year kind of quite took the cake when it came to just how the portrayal of insanity. Climax touched upon it in kind of a natural way, but this kind of like
in a modern way, I'd say.
But this movie kind of broke down the barriers of like, okay, what is like the step-by-step process of going insane? Like, what are the different stages that the mind goes through when it is placed in that type of an environment and it just has to survive? And I don't think I've ever seen a movie tackle that in this kind of way, and I freaking loved it because of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing I think I like the most about this movie. I mean, I love this movie. Let's just get that out of the way. It is in my consideration for top 10. Where it will fall, you'll find out next week, but it will be on that list, okay? So I just have to get that out of the way before I say this. The thing about this movie is, it is a horror film, and I'm so glad it's a horror film because it just shows, and every once in a while, a movie like this will come along where you don't need a ghoul, you don't need a zombie, you don't need some weird mythological being to be scary. Sometimes isolation and insanity are even more scarier than any paranormal or cosmic being could ever be. Let alone this is just a beautiful love letter to films of yesteryear, and how you don't need to have all the bells and whistles of the modern day to make a very intense and gripping movie. I mean, this film, I showed my grandpa the trailer, and he's like, I don't remember this one. And I was like, of course you don't, because it came out in 2019. And I did that on purpose to see if he could tell. And he couldn't tell. He couldn't tell this was different from the movies he grew up watching. And that's just a testament to, see, one thing I really enjoy is when a movie isn't the message is clear, right? And that is very clear in this film. Even though there is insanity and there is dementia and whatever you want to call it, these people are losing their goddamn minds. It's very clear what's happening, and it's very horrifying as well.
Yeah, kind of basically, like, again, just the words I don't know. I enjoy that you brought up the idea of kind of fooling your grandpa. That's actually really interesting, because the whole thing with this is, and the thing that I appreciate about Robert Eggers as a director is that his emphasis obviously is not on traditional horror values. His emphasis is first on, because he's got a background in theater. He started off as a working in the New York theater scene, and before he made his transition into film. And his whole thing that I very much admire both about The Witch and with this movie is that his primary goal is to get the setting right. Like, he is very focused, and is like, okay, his focus going into this is like, okay, I'm not making a horror movie, I'm making a period piece first. And I love that, because so far, with both of his movies now, he has absolutely nailed that setting. And that helps kind of add to the legitimacy, because you've heard all these stories about what happened in these types of scenarios with that, but this is the first time that I think we've ever seen that put to the screen. And it's not just the dealing with isolation and slowly, like, kind of dealing with internal horror. It's dealing with kind of, this is dealing with, like, Greek mythology. This is dealing with ideas of homosexuality. Like, they kind of, like, again, it's almost like your mind ends up going into the places that Pattinson's mind goes to as you're following him throughout. It's just like, is Defoe, like, actually a pirate, because this movie constantly plays around with, like, their backstories and who's lying about what. And there's a certain point in the movie where they're literally just going back and forth, and you don't know you literally can't even trust what the movie is presenting to you. Like, typically, like, movies are very, very obvious about, what is actually happening and what isn't. Obviously, they'll play around with the dream sequences or not, and the movie kind of starts that way, but in the latter half, you're just like, I have no fucking clue if what I'm watching is even happening, I really don't. And by the time the movie ends, you're like, was any of this that I saw, like, did it even happen? But in the best way possible. Like, they start off with the idea of superstition with the gulls containing the souls of dead sailors. And then, obviously, the way that they use the mermaids. First off, can I just say probably the best use of mermaids that I've ever seen in live action. First off, using this film and taking a fucking joke from How I Met Your Mother and putting that on full display and actually kind of tapping into the behind-the-scenes basis for that story. Obviously, the joke being that the whole thing of where mermaids were a myth made up because sailors, when they were out at sea for so long, would just get horny as fuck and start imagining these beautiful women that would call to them, also kind of the basis for the sirens in the original Greek mythology story, And then we start to get into this basis of Triton and whether the source of the light really is the fire that Prometheus gifted to man, which is why Willem Dafoe is so obsessed with it, And again, we get no answers to any of this stuff, and it is fucking incredible how it's wrapped up and kind of presented to us.
And it doesn't matter. So in the spirit of wrapping up, I mean, there's not much more to say about this film aside from go out and experience it for yourself. There might be a little off-putting there, being that it's black and white and being that it's shot in a more traditional way. I can understand how, like, maybe people our age, maybe that's why you didn't see it. But I am telling you, this movie is as gripping, if not more gripping, than any other horror film you will have seen from 2019. Give it a chance. Check it out, because you got to expose yourself to new things in life. That's how you grow. And what better way to grow than a movie that's going to make you ask yourself, well, did any of that even happen? Like, it's a very, so
yeah,
check this fucking movie out.
Most definitely. I recommend this movie heavily to everyone. Just in terms of, again, kind of the traditionalist horror fan, I would say that between this and this next film that we're about to talk about would definitely be the two most mainstream movies to check out. I would also suggest The Farewell as well. But Chris, kind of to wrap up this whole thing, this has been a great episode. I've had a fuck ton of fun.
I don't want it to end, but it has to end.
I honestly want to like have an episode for this every year where we just kind of break down and
can
talk
we do
about,
an A24 year in review?
Absolutely, we'll do an A24 year in review for every year going forward in January.
Can I throw one caveat in?
Yes,
because what I pride myself on, and I know you do as well, and I think what we're doing a great job of is only bringing content to our listeners that matters to us. And so as long as A24 is good and keeps being dynamite, then we'll do a year in review.
Keeps bringing us the content that audience goers deserve from their movies.
Which is probably going to happen. So we're good.
I think it will.
I just don't want to, I just don't want to, because I want to just keep this show as good as it can be for our listeners.
Definitely. So with that being said, we're diving into the last A24 film that we both saw.
The big one.
The big one. The one that wrapped up the year. Again, this film is just dynamite on so many different levels.
Fucking
I was privileged enough to watch this, get to an early screening. This was kind of my mid-90s for this year, where mid-90s, the whole thing was, I actually got to, when I watched that movie literally at its first ever screening back in July of 2018, before it was ever going to get a wide release.
So lucky.
And I unfortunately was not able to get to the initial release of this movie at Toronto, and I was unable to make the first screening of this film at New York Film Festival, but I made it to the encore screening, and oh man, this film, without a shadow of a doubt, was a fucking experience. And that is, of course, Benny and Josh Safdie's next effort in collaboration with A24, Uncut Gems, starring Adam Sandler. Oh my God. Like, Chris, how do we even go into this? Like,
this is an audio podcast. I'm sitting here shaking my head because I was kind of hoping you would tackle the beast.
Jesus, it's like, I feel like it's kind of one of those situations where we kind of bounce back and forth with kind of who tackles the podcast. You kind of fill in for me when I kind of like stumble on my words, but
so then what I will say is, because you had said to me that you don't get angry at the Oscars anymore because you know it's all
pointless too, because because they're predictable. They have shown their hand when it comes to the types of film that they will nominate, and it's just pointless getting angry at them because it's just ultimately a situation that will never be resolved.
And I agree, but I still got angry when Adam Sandler didn't even get a look.
And you weren't the only one.
Didn't even get a look. Like, I know that's wasted energy. I know that's wasted energy, and I know that's silly because we're not going to make a change. They're old, grumpy fucking Academy members that don't care, but
literally.
God, man.
Seriously.
Adam Sandler is, I mean, to call him a bright spot in this film means that you went blind watching it because everything is pretty much working, but he's got to be the brightest spot if all those lights are up to 100.
He's the highest. This is not a character at all that you want to like relate to. This is a low down gambling, like the worst kind of gambling addict that you could ever think. And just right off the bat, you can tell this movie's going to be special because this is probably the first movie that I've ever seen that tackles gambling addiction in the most realistic way possible. Like,
well, it just shows you that it's just as real of an addiction as anything else.
Like, it is an illness. Like, this movie portrays this guy like he is mentally ill. And there is not 1 second in this movie where I don't believe that. And how Sandler fucking portrays that as compellingly as it does. Like, and that's not even getting into the actual plot of the movie, of what this movie's about, which unfortunately I've done a little bit of a disservice there, which is that Adam Sandler portrays Howard Ratner, who is a diamond store owner on West 47th, who is heavily in debt to his mobster brother-in-law, portrayed brilliantly by Eric Bogosian. And things start to take a little bit of a change when he ends up getting a massive uncut opal straight from an Ethiopian diamond mine that supposedly has magical properties to it, which will hopefully help him out in his notorious betting. But things, of course, go immediately wrong when his assistant brings in actual basketball player Kevin Garnett as a potential client, and Garnett sees the opal and wants it badly because he thinks it'll bring him good luck on his games. And this, of course, sets Sandler down a rabbit hole of just misfortune after misfortune after misfortune. This movie to me was, what is the formula? It's the Henry something, well, the Henry's law of movies, where everything that can go wrong will go wrong, and it just gets worse and worse. It's an escalation of de-escalation, and it is fucking brilliant in every sense of its presentation there.
And so to take that last sentence of yours and apply it just to other people aside from Adam Sandler, I mean, even the kids in this movie played their part, and they played their part well. Like this movie was, it was intelligent and it was smart, and it was presented in a sleazy light. It was presented in like, oh, these are the scumbags in New York City and we're trying to rip everyone off, eh? But to be honest with you, it's so intelligently written that you're just like watching this high level of scumbaggery and crime and just twisted, fucked up people who live in these beautiful houses out in Long Island or wherever they live and go into the city for work. But like, you never wonder what your neighbors do to get to be in the same neighborhood as you. And this movie makes you think twice about that. Definitely. That's all I'm saying.
And Chris, so you described this film as being similar to what kind of an experience?
A heart attack.
Yeah. And that's
how I felt.
100% accurate.
In a completely different way that Climax did.
Absolutely. But it like kind of like, this is kind of like how this is why this is the perfect way to bookend it, where the minute that this film gets started, like you described it as a heart attack, I describe it as just a rush of adrenaline, where there is not a single moment in this movie where you are not on the edge of your seat, fucking tense, waiting to see what happens. But not just in the sense of like you're scared for Adam Sandler's life, which he is. He is in danger of his life literally from the minute you see him walking on the street on screen after he gets his colonoscopy. Ironically enough, where fucking, but again, you're laughing, you're crying with him. Like fucking, he portrays this guy as like a sympathetic person, and he's fucking the source of all of his pain. Where somehow every single other person in this movie has a rational reason for being angry or pissed off or just fed up with him and his nonsense. And you just can't look away. You just can't not watch him. He's so goddamn compelling in that sense. And oh my God, like, I don't think I've ever seen anybody say the line, "Holy fuck, I'm gonna come," in a non-comedic sense and still have it be fucking hilarious. It's so goddamn funny.
Yeah, so Adam Sandler has found a way to work in the industry that hasn't always put his talents in the best of light. And I totally understand it. I mean, at the end of the day, I just want to be able to make money off of doing what I love. So if I was in his shoes, I would not turn down Just Go With It or Click or anything like that people give him flack for. I get it. But he's an actor, just as Robert De Niro is, just as Willem Dafoe is, and he shows that in this movie. So all I have to say is, if you are a fan of Billy Madison and he's the joke guy to you, but you've always really liked Adam Sandler, check this movie out, because maybe he doesn't have to just be the joke guy to you. Maybe if enough of us kind of get on board and give him praise, he won't threaten to put out his worst movie yet, like he is right now. Because I don't want that to happen.
Nobody to blame for themselves. Like, if Sandler actually goes through with that threat, I'm like, come on. I mean, I won't watch it because I don't watch any of his bad movies. But again, just talking about Sandler, I feel like does a disservice to the Safdies and their really, like, this is some of the best filmmaking of the year. Like, again, I shouted out a ton of people, like One O Tricks Point Never with the score, Darius Khondji with the cinematography, the Safdies themselves, and Ronald Bronzy with You're Right. This writing was smart.
To talk about this film in 15 minutes like we are is a disservice,
really
but we have to do it for the episode.
But again, it's just one of those situations where you gotta see it. And the good thing is that it looks like people have, because I'm pretty sure that this is A24's highest grossing movie to date, which, again, A24 movies are never really known for breaking box office records, but this is one where I'm like, fuck yeah, let's go. So,
and speaking of that, the box office records, and I think a nice way to wrap this out is, if you've liked anything we've said about these movies, please go watch it, because 18 million might seem like a lot of money to you, but if you know anything about film, you know that that's chump change. And the fact that A24 finally got on the map a little bit that way means that people are waking up, but I still don't think enough people know about the studio. So check out any of these movies. Hell, check out any of the movies that they've put out this year, because they're all great so far. I mean,
they're literally all great. With the exception of Midsommar, I haven't been disappointed by a single A24 movie.
But there's at least thought behind them. So yes. I wasn't the biggest fan of High Life, but I at least recognize the skill and talent behind it. So that's what you get with Midsommar.
I give Ari Aster credit for being a good technician.
Exactly.
And just to put this in perspective, in order to wrap this up with the box office numbers, on a budget of less than $20 million, it just says less than $20 million, this movie grossed $46.9 million. Technically, double the budget is considered a profit. This movie made a fucking profit.
That's a beautiful thing. That gives me hope going into the future. That just gets me excited for where film can go. It's a nice bright spot in a very weirdly turning dark industry in my eyes. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. The film industry is getting crazier and crazier as time goes on. So with that being said,
we did
that was our episode talking about the movies, the A24 episode for talking about 2019. We have one more episode talking about 2019, which is, of course, our episode that will be up next week, which is, of course, we're finally getting to it, people, our top 10 of 2019. That's going to be a very fascinating list in order to get into. I hope that you guys stick around for it. I hope that you guys have enjoyed listening to these episodes. Thank you again, of course, for putting up with us for our week absence. And so with that being said, Chris, where can people find us on the interwebs?
Well, that's a great question, Dom. They can find us anywhere that matters. I'll start off by saying that. And it's just at Talkin TV. no G, TalkinTV. And if you need a little more of an explanation, Chris, that was a little vague. Okay. Facebook, Twitter. We're going to be on YouTube really soon. Keep your eyes peeled for that. Instagram.
Most importantly.
All those places. When I say Twitter, I mean my personal Twitter, which I promote the show on. I know you don't have one, Dom, but I'm carrying the torch on Twitter.
I deleted Twitter.
So go and check me out there at Christian Ivanko. I make music, I make podcasts. My band's The Stash. My podcast is Talkin TV. You know that. And thank you guys for being here, as always.
And of course, you can follow me on my personal stuff all over the place. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, at Movie Nerd Reviews, all one word or multiple words. It'll come up either way, no matter how you do it. I've been releasing some videos finally after my batch of reviews that are released in December. I did my top 10 most anticipated for 2020, my top 10 worst of 2019, which I just released today. And I will have my top 20 favorite movies of 2019 releasing on that channel in some capacity coming out soon. And of course, in terms of where you can listen to this podcast, like I mentioned, we are on Anchor. We are on Spotify at Talkin TV Podcast, all one word. But also, we are on Apple Podcasts as well. We are on Google. We are on Breaker. We are on all the other different subscription platforms.
Radio Public, Stitcher, all those places.
All those places. So.
And thank you guys for, it seems like people at least listen across most of them, so thank you.
Definitely.
And with that being said, I would be remiss of my duties if I didn't turn it over to Dom to take us out of here on this dynamite episode, if I will add. Dom, how do we like to close this dynamite episode of a show?
Watch more fucking movies, people. We out.
What, one more time because of how dynamite this episode was. Really put your all into it.
All right. Watch more fucking movies.